It's my distinct privilege today to introduce this afternoon's reader, the poet Joshua Robbins. Before I do that, I need to thank Jeanette Woodburn and Kimberly Chan from the library and Michael Dittmore in the Humanities Division for making this event possible. Joshua Robbins is the author of Praise Nothing, which was a finalist for the 2013 Miller-Williams Prize. His poems have been published and anthologized widely, and he's received the New South Poetry Award, the Copper-Nickel Poetry Prize, and the James Wright Poetry Prize. He earned a PhD in English Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Tennessee, and is currently Assistant Professor of English at the University of the Incarnate Word in San Antonio. But I first met Josh at about 11 in the morning, Pacific Daylight Time, on September 11th, 2001. We were both about to begin our MFA program at the University of Oregon, and we'd arranged to meet that day for coffee ahead of time. I mentioned Pacific Time for two reasons. First, to indicate that we were a whole continent's length away from the location of the terrible events of that morning, and second, to point to the strange workings of distance in the wake of tragedy. It was a normal day in Eugene, and it was peaceful. The light had slanted into its autumn slant, and we drank coffee on the back patio of Espresso Aroma and talked about poetry as if the entire world hadn't just changed. Because I just moved to town and hadn't gotten a TV yet, Josh invited me over to his apartment afterwards, where we watched the news with his wife for the rest of the afternoon. And I mention this not merely as biography or autobiography, but because I believe there is in that set of facts the beginnings of a context in which we might better hear the poems we'll hear today. Though we avoided it for a few hours that morning, the world had changed. And Joshua Robbins is one of only a handful of poets I know of writing today, and certainly one of the only ones of his or my generation who's vigorously committed to nurturing the lyric poem as a form of public discourse and as a form of necessary response to that change. There are any number of people who might pay lip service to this, but in his teaching, his thinking, and his poetry, this is the project that motivates Josh. During the first decade of this millennium, a decade of very real wars and horrors and catastrophes, we found ourselves in the midst of a culture determined not to address these, but rather to emphasize the movement from one spectacular manufactured crisis to the next. This, and I believe I can say this because I know Josh so well, this is the set of problems, the failure of humanity and the failure of our culture to address it, that forged this poet's sensibility. I think of the opening of his poem Collateral. Once I watched my neighbor return from the Gulf bring a weathered length of scrap 2x4 down without hesitating upon the wrecked spine of a Dalmatian stray. This is a sensibility that, no matter the horrors it encounters, remains faithful to them in the representations it makes. It does this not to shock us, but to show us with the greatest possible accuracy of detail what has become of us. Well, we've been distracted for years now by our phones and tablets and reality TV. At the core of this sensibility, of Josh's sensibility, is a commitment to poetry's oldest and most traditional impulse, mimetic fidelity, the accurate representation of what the poem takes up into its gaze. There's a need here to get it right, in other words, and it is a need that arises precisely because the poet understands that poetry cannot be anything but public, which means that the poet has a tremendous responsibility, a responsibility that is part of the poetic tradition itself, to know the tradition, to respect the tradition, and to pull it, even if it has become as stubborn as a goat at the end of a rope, into the present reality of our lives. But to be clear, Josh is not a traditionalist for tradition's sake. Though I've had a wonderful time pointing to his use of structures like the Greek choral ode and the greater romantic lyric in class over the past few weeks, Josh's work is in fact an embodiment of the idea that we do not merely study tradition so that we might describe it or repeat it. The point, rather, is to change it. Please help me give a very warm welcome to my very dear friend, Josh Robbins.
Hello, everybody. That's going to be hard to follow. Thanks for that, Jeff. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. So I'd like to thank Pepperdine for having me and the Creative Writing Department for hosting me. And I want to thank all the students who welcomed me yesterday afternoon. I had such a good time talking with all of you. Such a talented group. Very impressive. And I know you all you're going to do great things. I know Jeff is very grateful for you too. The last time I gave a reading at a university was in an art gallery, and at the back of the just right directly in front of me, actually, from the podium, was a painting of a guy with a gun, just like this. So I'm sitting up here, and this is a whole lot more serene. I'll take this. Well, I'm going to read some poems from Praise Nothing, and then I think I'm going to read a couple new poems, if that's okay. I've not test-driven them yet, so you'll have to give me some notes after. The poems in Praise Nothing are really about issues of faith and doubt that I've experienced my whole life. I'm going to talk a little bit about that during the reading. Really, the quest is to try and find language that can find a way to address what transcends us, to find ways to maybe even make language transcendent. I don't know if that's actually possible, but that's why poetry is a project. But perhaps we can find ways of doing that through the poems. I'm going to start with, I only have one poem about Los Angeles, or that mentions Los Angeles, so I thought I would start with that. It's called Heaven Has Nothing But Distance. And when my grandfather was 19 years old, he didn't grow up in a Christian home, a religious home. He said he felt called by the Holy Spirit to leave his house at 19 and move to Los Angeles and become a street preacher. And so at 19 years old, he left everything, hopped a train from Topeka with just a brown bag with a sandwich and an apple, and took the train to Los Angeles and started a career in ministry at 19 years old. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. So the poem is trying to figure out what would possess a 19-year-old kid to do that. Heaven has nothing but distance. Maybe it was enough to believe the zodiac's blazing entirety would be cast from the sky, an effortless handful of salt scattered to the Kansas plains red wheat. Out west, souls every day were shedding their earthly inheritance. The refused histories of cause and effect, blight, hunger with a trace of Santa Fe railway coal dusting grocers' displays. And so my grandfather, too, who, having left Topeka for Los Angeles' early sprawl, exits the train station's dim into day's white flash, and takes one step onto his upturned apple crate. A new Bible in his palm, he begins to explain why all things are fire, what it is that makes you ache awake. Once, on a gritty city beach in California, with flies, stinking strands of rotting kelp, styrofoam, he and I sat watching a gull choir, first eyeball, then swoop, then peck, almost in unison. Something tangled in a blue tarp, washed in above the tide's pull. a drowning victim, maybe a vagrant. And though we were unable to see what was there, when he put his hand in mine, I could not even begin to count all the things I wished to believe in. And that is how it would be if what I remembered was as true as the waves landing. But now there is only the lungless hot breath of LA on my cheek, the cries of gulls, their wings ruffling into flight. The night after his memorial, someone dug into Kansas silt loam, dug a hole, dropped into it the plastic baggie with his ashen remains. Nothing then but distance in every direction. Above us, a satellite's beacon begged the horizon for home. The heaven scales measured the darkness, and that was all. Okay. This is a poem called Doxology. You all know the doxology? Should we sing it? Sometimes I sing it. Do you want to sing it? Okay, we won't sing it. But the doxology, praise God from whom all blessings flow, etc., is the most widely sung hymn in the world. And a lot of the poems in the book are in direct response to hymns I sang growing up in the church, trying to understand, what they meant to me then and what they mean to me now. As I mentioned, kind of one of the running themes is this exploration of faith and doubt. And so this is one of the first poems that I wrote that really tackles those ideas. Doxology. Because spring's grace by now is worth nothing more than the vacant wind as it lays down cheat grass and smooth brome into the scrawled roadside shade of a hand-lettered billboard's "He is risen." I can raise now this sweating and half-empty long neck to August's full bloom and bring it back to my lips half full, blessed by whatever it is that jinx the last monarchs fluttering like quarter notes over the driveway, its flat, sun-glittered tongue, its hymn of sawdusted motor oil ascending into nothing but the wash lines, pinned-up T-shirts and damp shorts, flapping pointless as prayer flags in the sweltering breeze. And although fall is back soon with its hard tally of leaf change and leaf drop, its apostate yawn of jaundiced light hung in the barren trees like torn sackcloth, I'm content for now to love, to watch summer's penitents stumble down the path of sweat and sacrifice, contrite women with bad knees and sensible shoes, young mothers like exhausted pilgrims pushing their chubby toddlers who point to the empty sky. Even the bare-chested young men who jog the tortured asphalt with furrowed brows, seared by August's mark and headed God knows where, who know we all take nothing with us, not even the relief of these our long purgatorial shadows. When I was writing about hymns, I figured I should probably define what I mean by hymn. So I wrote this poem called "When I Say Hymn," and there are a couple references in here. John Newton wrote the hymn "Amazing Grace." He was the slaveholder who became the great abolitionist. And then Janis Joplin also makes an appearance in the poem. And if you don't know, her nickname was Pearl. When I say hymn, I mean breaker crashed gunnels, yes, John Newton's near shipwreck conversion, and of course Amazing Grace. But, as Janis Joplin skreeked it, her voice full-throated and grainy, bending the phrasing. And it's two young men, homeless on a suburban church pew, one high or getting there, the other striking matches, each small flame tossed toward a pile of gasoline-soaked hymnals. And how the day after the fire, we sang over the sanctuary's ashy smolder. And it's the photo tucked in my mother's Bible, the one she snapped circa 1967, Pearl's mouth wailing, the stage set ablaze by the fiery coal of her heart that summer of love. Sundays, having passed out the night before, Mom would sing, "A wretch like me," tuneless but extra loud. Raise her Bible when the preacher's tongue cast our sins away. How we burned then, bright as when we first believed. That happened when I was, I think, in first grade. The church we went to used to let the area homeless people sleep in the pews at night, and one night the sanctuary got burned down. They had made a fire in the sanctuary and it burned down. This is another hymn poem responding to the hymn, "His Eyes on the Sparrow." Do you all know that hymn? And this is about Knoxville. I used to live in Tennessee, and I used to take the bus. I didn't have a car, and so I'd ride around on my way to the university on the bus, and we would go under this one freeway pass every morning. And one morning, I happened to look up from what I was reading, and I saw this man climbing up. You know, there's that kind of crawl space underneath an overpass, and this man had kind of set up a place to live under there, and it's just an image that stuck with me. Sparrow. A man doubles over to fit the angled crawl space beneath the overpass. His makeshift shelter against January, against its icy transfiguration of every last facade and exposed city surface. Surely he signifies something more than that which two slumped shoulders and a sunken chest might represent to those of us, sleepless in surrounding subdivisions. The last unlit match, perhaps, which, when struck and held in the cup of a palm, has everything to do with prayer. This much we know. No one thing corresponds to any other. A midnight trucker's jake-breaking detonates sound wall concrete, and we lie awake cursing suburbia's toothless ordinances, which comforts no one and is as useless as questioning the possibility of mercy, that his eye is on the sparrow. What I remember are weeknights spent at church, how the derelicts gathered below on benches and cold pavement looked up, and how first we circled the upright, sang each verse and refrain. Only after did we open our doors. This is called "There is a Fountain," and responds to a hymn by William Cowper, who was an 18th century British poet and clergyman. And I was reading about him, and there was an excerpt from a letter or a diary where he was talking about his writing method. And he said that he would get up every morning at 4 a.m., and he would sit and wait for the Spirit to speak to him, and then he would go to sleep until about 9 or 10, and then he would wake up and he would have a poem. And I just thought, well, why can't it be that easy? What do I have to do? I get up at 4 a.m. every day to write? So this is sort of trying to respond to William Cowper. Yeah, he said, the Spirit whispered the poem into my heart. And I thought, that would be so nice. There is a fountain. Gasoline stink of just mowed dry grass, black bag trash, mulch, station wagon oil, driveway stains. Out of these, the melody of Midwestern drought. This sumac tremolo from a bird I can't name, this ash-gray lump trilling its fevered hymn over the dusty tract house roofs. Bird of feathered putty, bird of oblivion's blur, smudge bird. Unlike you, I am exhausted by the sky's indifference. The ground is cracked and the world is ready to blaze. Yet I need nothing but this. Your song filling the cul-de-sac, your song of fire never burning out. There are a lot of bird poems in the book, and when I gave my wife the manuscript and I gave her all these different titles, and she was like, no, none of these work. She cursed, but she said, you have to call this book Birds and the Stuff That They Do. She put a different word in there. But other than birds, there's a lot of suburbia in the book. And when I lived in Kansas, there was this one particular strip mall that I used to walk by fairly frequently. And I sort of always had a fascination with strip malls and kind of suburbia. There's something about, the shine of suburbia that just is sort of ominous and plastic, and what are we covering up here? But this one strip mall was sort of interesting. It was kind of L-shaped, and at one end was an adult bookstore, and then next to it was a liquor store, so it was sort of fitting, and then next to it was an insurance company, and then there was a vacant store, then vacant store with a broken out window and plywood, and then there was a church at the very other end. And I just remember seeing that and thinking, well, there's got to be a metaphor here for the soul. And so maybe you'll see that too if you believe in those sorts of things. Metaphors, I mean. And this is called Against Forgiveness. In this life, nothing need be forgiven. Not the streetlight's high murmur, or the rattle of shopping carts windblown across the parking lot. Not the skir of asphalt worn to gravel. What could be better? This slow fade of sidewalk weeds and the sky's dingy light spread like a rag over the faux terracotta roof tiles of the strip mall liquor store. Its sad neon wink, its inventory of forgetting. Outside, a boy with spiked hair and choke chain collar waits for a buyer, and none of it calls anything into question. So, what is this need you have to ask why you still can't remember the name of a lover you had once, who could only come in the back seat of your car? Who knew then that whatever your thoughts of heaven, by now they would be long unutterable? Go ahead, take his money, no need to remember. Buy him a fifth of whatever's cheap, pocket the change, and keep walking. Doing okay? Okay. Here's another suburbia poem. It's called Dithyramb with Streetlight. It's pretty short. Do you know what the dithyramb is? Yeah. So the dithyramb is kind of a component of an ancient Greek hymn that revelers who were praising Dionysus would would sing, and part of those rituals would be ritualistic drinking and screwing and kind of creating an ecstatic moment. And I had a sort of similar feeling once riding the bus, by this Kmart that had when Kmart went under, it was just this abandoned blight on the Knoxville landscape. But then we turned around the corner, and behind the Kmart was this car, and you could see that this had become like a hangout for high school kids. And I used to be one of those high school kids. So I kind of wrote this poem for them. It sort of responds to Emily Dickinson, too. In her poem, there's a certain slant of light. Dithyramb with streetlight. There's a certain slant of dark, too. A streetlight's flicker, say, cast across a blocked-up Datsun's hood, parked there behind the vacant Kmart where the kids get high to hoist themselves above the turnpike's high-pitched whine in their blood. And they know there's no more to take from heaven, that all that's left is patched asphalt and chain link. One of my other obsessions is the problem of evil. You all are 20, so you probably have the same obsession. For whatever reason, it never left me. For my faith, this is the biggest sort of stumbling block, is trying to understand God's nature in the face of evil and suffering in the world. And I have read everything I can get my hands on. And I've never found anything, of course, that's satisfactory. If someone wrote the theodicy that could solve it, then we would be done. And it's just deeply frustrating. And I've gone back to the book of Job recently, and I was reading the book of Job trying to find a theodicy there, and that's what triggered this poem. But there's this moment in the book of Job where Job finally, kind of the situational irony breaks down, and Job finally gets a chance to say to God, like, God, what the hell? And God's answer is basically, can you make a big fish? Can you make a snowstorm? Can you make an ocean? I didn't think so, so shut up. And it's not very satisfactory. So I thought I would try and write my own. And so this poem is called Theodicy. Predestined for the warehouses of the snow, cold sweeps east across the asphalt and the darkening suburbs. I think of Job and wonder if God ever really returned to business. After he'd consented to boils and crushed livestock, servants and children's throats slit, after ash, maybe one still afternoon, God raised both hands above his head as if to say, I've had enough, and renounced all of it. Took a job behind a desk wearing khaki-colored scrubs, filing papers to code and answering the phones. His voice far away, uninterested, yet familiar to those desperate on the other end of the line. If it were you fidgeting in the waiting room, you'd not even notice him. Just north, past the ridgeline's barren pin oaks, I watch in the rear view as the office park's cold silhouette dissolves into the outskirts of suburban sprawl. If God is with us, then maybe he lives around here too, some duplex on a loop or a single apartment with a satellite dish. Maybe right now God is like us, commuting across town toward home or headed from work to the store, or maybe he's just driving. his window cracked to feel the cold as the sun descends, while the rest of us pull into our driveways, jangle our keys at the front door, and try to keep on believing, even as we lock it behind us and turn out the light. So Jeff told me that Michael Reagan was here recently, and I think he read here. I'm not a conservative, really, by any means, but I love conservative talk radio, and I love listening to Michael Reagan. I actually haven't listened to him for a little while, but is he still on the radio? So I thought, well, I have a couple Ronald Reagan poems, so I thought maybe I would read those. When I was born 10 weeks early, and I weighed 3 pounds 1 ounce. And my dad, who loves Ronald Reagan, my dad gave me the nickname Newt because of the movie Newt Rockney, in which Ronald Reagan played the Gipper, right? Yeah. So the poem mentions that. It's a poem for my dad and sort of tries to imagine what he was going through while there I was. I basically died like 10 times and they somehow resuscitated me. Trying to imagine what he was going through. I have 2 kids of my own now, 2 boys, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I cannot even imagine this. Of the father. Bolted down in the corner, the black and white hospital set rebroadcast Newt Rockney All-American and the Gipper's Last Wish. My father stubs out another bummed smoke, rolls his sleeves, exhales. Through tear gas and batons, he once linked arms with others, believing theirs would be the generation to end it. But in this moment, he is thinking of the life he abandoned in Kansas, wearing down converts with brimstone and ash, of his ghost-pained brother who jumped from the roof of the VA and died alone. At the waiting room window, he watches the afternoon drop below Berkeley's hills, the traffic up Ashby braking and coughing as down the hall his son is born 10 weeks too soon. In a couple of months, Inauguration Day, though already school children are posed as practice targets, their bodies piled like cordwood in the streets, their makeshift coffins scavenged from the walls of bombed-out homes. And somewhere the televised light will remain the color of smoke as 21 guns salute and the world preps its cruelties. Okay, I'm going to try and read some new poems. I have some Texas poems, finally. I wondered when I would finally write some Texas poems. I'm not a Texan yet, I've been told. I don't know that I can ever become a Texan. I don't know that I would ever want to become a Texan. Oh, this is on video. This poem is about driving sort of in the panhandle recently. It's called Eschatology in Crayon Wax, and it has an epigraph, which is from Ronald Reagan's campaign slogan, which is "It's morning again in America." Eschatology in Crayon Wax. October, and the Llano Estacado's echoless sea of dry grass mingles with the state's highway dust and falls rumors of Ebola. And the firmament's half-asphyxiated petitions for rain. In plain view, I stop for gas, Drop my last 20 for a paper and 15 on pump number 3. The attendant offers his requisite God bless and nod, and I go out to fill. Behind him, the greasy rotisserie turns 100% Texas beef. Its hum vaguely tempting and just as cliched, predictable as the radio evangelist whose Sunday call-in show I've been following since Amarillo. Something about Putin's rise, the tribulation, RFID tags, and freedom's number of days. This far south, the prophecy's signal is as much white noise as it is likely, though the headline on the newspaper below the fold might beg to differ. Man sees mark of the beast, cuts off microwave's hand. I remember children's church, coloring in the angel with his bowl of wrath, the beast with 7 heads, its 7 crowns, the pale horse and rider I shaded with green, an entire middle-class eschatology in crayon wax, bleeding into my anxious prayers against Gorbachev, duck and cover, the dollar's decline. And yet, those Sundays, too, were just another morning in America, rising then as it did here today, as it did 3 days ago, over the aluminum belly of that off-the-grid Airstream and its warped linoleum, where the body bled out and was prepped to rise. Suicide noteless, save for the highlighted scripture open beside him, something about saints and the trumpet's fiery blare, the morning star gleaming in the still sky like serrated steel, its glint beneath the kitchenette's fluorescence, just before the sawzall's teeth met wrist flesh, before the makeshift tourniquet and the bloody thumbprint on the microwave punched to max. Due east, the Caprock and the graded caliche rise and fall like an entire history of belief buried beneath the Panhandle's alluvial fans. Everything I've learned of Eden and the angel, its fiery sword, Nineveh and the windows of heaven opened. Everything I've learned of that Roman execution, and how all of it was reason enough to fear a port wine birthmark, the mark of the beast, and ATMs. The pump clicks off and I head in. Hours from home, I spend what's left on a hot dog and a Coke and pocket the loose change. Even now, my prayer's the same. Trust in the Lord and lean not on my own understanding of liberty, perestroika, the radical fall. Okay. I think I'll read one more and then see if there are any questions and then read just one final one. Sound good? Okay. This is a new poem too, called Rope Swing. And it alludes to this painting I saw in a gallery downtown San Antonio by this artist named Vincent Valdez. And what he did was, and this is not really talked about outside of San Antonio and sort of outside of the Hispanic community, of the number of lynchings in Texas of Latino people. I don't know why. I mean, I guess we could talk about why it doesn't get that much attention. And so what he did was he had volunteers basically hang themselves. He, fashioned a noose, and then he took photos of them, and he had a partner hold their legs so that they wouldn't choke or break their necks. And he took photos of them and then painted the images. But when he painted them, he removed the rope. And so and these paintings are, they're life size. So you're forced to confront this person and this body. And so many of them, their hands are bound like this. And so it looks like they're just suspended in prayer, and it's sort of like they're rising. They're quite stunning. Rope swing. When my son said, "Daddy, this rope is a door," and the pecans sickled green silvered above the highest branch, the one I reached only the day before, teetering atop the topmost rung of a borrowed ladder, and tying a knot as incomprehensible to me as a Texas breeze on certain mornings, like those when a 2-year-old's metaphor hangs in the air suspended by nothing. I knew I must move through the space leveraged by his body because there was no knowing when the beauty he opened would close. And in the same thought, I remembered Jeremy, a friend in middle school, who had no rope, and so wrenched together wire hangers stolen from his father's closet, enough to fashion a noose around his neck, loop it over a park bathroom stall door frame. I swore I'd never tell. His attempt failed, and now the failure of my promise swings like a rope across the empty page and hangs from the end of this Y at the end of his name. Its sound, that unanswerable question, and the door through which we all enter if you believe there are questions, if you believe there are answers. When asked why he painted only the bodies of the anonymous and not the rope that hanged them, the artist in the gallery opening said the absence of a noose is the threat of a noose. And so each man floats against his blank canvas, caught in an erased instant and struggling to keep in focus, as if each contortion were an unwritten history, every true thing I know nothing about, and so cannot enter. The impossible facts of their bodies. Which is why there can be no alibi for refusing to write it now. How before he told me, my friend took me to see a body found beneath a tree in the same park. Around its neck a rope of blood, as the fog's white hands descended over the police, ushering the crowd past the cordoned way out. Where we went, I don't remember. If truth is beauty, then rope, whether it is fixed to a branch, or is the idea of a rope, or is a blood rope, in this poem, it is not beauty. And though there may be the faintest whisper made by graphite pressed and moved across this page now, a sound like wind hushing shade trees or the sound of fibers stretched by a swinging body's weight, each printed letter's curved line or closed loop is not a rope, is not a noose. No matter my desire to bind memory's hands behind the back of my future, as I climb the ladder and await the drop and hope finally to know. Okay. Any questions? I don't know how to segue into questions after that. Thank you for listening to those. I've never read those before. What questions? Any questions? Yes, please.
First of all, it's not Japan. Clearly, I'm a Southerner, neither am I, but I was once told by a lady in my church in Tennessee that when she asked me what kind of pie I was making for Thanksgiving, and I said, she said, pecan. Pecan is what you put under your bed in the winter. It's pecan.
I'll make that.
No, just thank you for reading your poems. I have something more serious to say. You were talking about initially about reaching, hoping to, in some way, touch transcendent language if there is such a thing. And I hear a lot of, with flames, a lot of burning and fire goes up and then it becomes ash. And so I hear this arc of back and forth. Sometimes there's a movement through the liminality, and at other times it just seems closed off. and there's this just a beautiful kind of rhythm, but a continuity of, you know, asphalt and oil and things that burn and that need to burn in order to congeal, but are also, you know, parts of our contemporary suburban life that we find limiting. So anyway, it's just a comment, but I really enjoyed hearing the fire and flame and ash going through all the poems, especially in the book.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think fire is, it is something, for whatever reason. To be honest, I've not really thought so much about why fire, but it does come back again and again and again. And I think it's, I guess for me, it is a symbol of faith, and it's something, at least in my faith experience, it's something that burns brightly and very hot, and then I have times where it's extinguished, and what we're left with is the ash. There's something ceremonial about that too, liturgical. But I like the fact that, you know, when something burns, it leaves traces of itself, and that's the ash. And it sort of has embedded within it the possibility that it will reemerge. And that's very much my experience with faith, too. Yes, sir. Somebody asked me this yesterday in class. And I said that I hate to answer this question because the question was why the title Praise Nothing. The first thing is the title is not an imperative. It's not a command of you shouldn't praise something or don't praise anything. The idea of nothing, I guess, is sort of similar to the way I was just discussing fire and ash. Wallace Stevens has a poem called "The Snowman," in which he talks about the nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. And I really like this idea because, you know, I yearn for God. I want there to be God. I want to be able to think that I can know God, but I'm not sure that I can. So to put a name on God, a face on God, sort of limits, I think, the possibility and maybe closes down my quest somewhat. So I mean God with Praise Nothing. It's sort of Zen, too. You know, it's a concept that's kind of hard to wrap my mind around sometimes. Yeah. Maybe I'll read just one more poem, and then we'll call it a night. Okay. Okay. This poem is called "Washing in the Sangam." And the Sangam, it's called the Triveni Sangam, and this is outside of Allahabad, India. And it's the place where these three rivers meet, the Ganges River and the Yamuna River, and then there's this third sort of mythical spiritual river that runs through them too, called the Saraswati. And there's this amazing pilgrimage that takes place every year. And the images that come out of this pilgrimage, you can see them online. National Geographic has some amazing pictures. They're just stunning. And so the poem is it comes out of that. The Kumbh Mela is the name of the pilgrimage. It's a Hindu pilgrimage. And so they engage, the pilgrims engage in this kind of ritualistic bathing in the water there. Washing in the Sangam. The believers, villagers, astrologers, philanthropists, ash-smeared expatriates, and hippies seeking salvation all gather at the Sangam, where the Yamuna's dark waters, the brown currents of the Ganges, and the Saraswati converge. One man raises his arms, wades chest high into polluted water. Another sings. This one begs at the shoreline as dogs scavenge for food, their long tongues lapping puddles of offered milk. Over our breakfast of small handfuls of Cheerios, pieces of dry toast, 5 tangerine wedges, I watch my son organize what I've provided. Cold fruit centered down his high chair's tray, the cereal and bread on either side. Son, through faith you found this hunger answered, even as I turn away in our ordinary house from the look of wonder in your face. The expression Christ must have had seeing Lazarus raised, or the face of the Buddha who looked behind him to find lotus blossoms opening in praise. Thank you all very much.